Hello and welcome to Inside Great Minds with Adam Outland. I am your host, and today I get to introduce you to Ryan Goepel. Ryan started his career in sales similar to myself. However, he ramped up into the accounting, controller, CFO pathway in life. And I thought this made for an awesome, interesting interview because for me and my background, I don't get the opportunity to learn about leadership inside the financial side of companies as much as I do maybe the sales or just general management side. And Ryan really sheds the light on what makes for a successful CFO. He also shines the light on a lot of unique stories and experiences he's had as he followed a top tier leadership team from company to company. He was part, just as a highlight, he was part of the Burger King IPO and helped lead that Burger King IPO. He ended up being the CFO of a company that was acquired by Schlumberger. And today, currently, he's the CFO for a private airline and sits on the board as well. So what an extensive experience to draw from. He's still very young in the life of his career, but he's accomplished a lot. And he has a lot of little lessons to share about how communication skills, leadership skills, and decision-making play a critical role in how to become successful in any position, including that of a chief financial officer. So with that introduction, I hope you really enjoy the episode of Inside Great Minds with Ryan Goepel.
Yeah. So we have Ryan Goepel with us today. Did I say the last name right?
Goepel. It's Goepel. I think is the real name, but I think it's a more. I take all versions.
Is there like a Houston version, and then?
Yeah, I think so. I've just kind of gotten. It was like close enough.
Sounds good. So Ryan and I first got together and met in Houston when I moved there 8 years ago. And it was kind of a random phone call that I made because I had just started a career in consulting. And I was like, hey, look at that. This guy, Ryan, sold educational books at the same company I did door to door back in college. Maybe we can go grab tacos and he can help inform me of the world of business in Houston. So I think you introduced me to, what was the place that we went to?
Only went to Lupe's.
That's right. You introduced me to true Texas fajitas at the finest.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. 8 years later, I've just, I've grown with all my Houston dietary needs. Tends to happen. Anyway, so to make a long story short, one of the reasons I was so excited to have you on is you kind of have a unique career track. We've interviewed one other person, David Gow, who's here in Houston, runs Gow Media Group, ESPN, Culture Map, and he kind of had that CFO background a little bit as well. But you have kind of such a unique journey. Honestly, just looking at your LinkedIn, how many places and things that you've done. And so I just thought it'd be really cool to hear a little bit about that story and how you got to where you are.
Okay.
So, thanks for coming on.
No problem.
If people have listened to this podcast enough, they know a little bit about the book selling era. But you grew up in Canada, right?
Yeah, Vancouver. Born and raised in Vancouver. Yeah, that's where I started. I was there until I left for grad school in about 26.
So, and your family and friends from Vancouver didn't think you were absolutely bonkers for deciding to relocate to Houston for 14 years?
Yeah, they did. It was even more circuitous than that. I went to College Station, which is, a subset. That's where I did grad school there.
Yeah. Oh, really? Okay.
So I think the cultural adjustment from Houston to College Station was significant. And then, as we go into my career stuff, I went to Houston right after, but then I went to Moscow, and then I went to Miami, and then I came to Houston, and I was there for about 12. That's when I did the 12-year run in Houston before heading back to Miami.
Wow. So, got it. So, yeah. Vancouver's absolutely stunning, beautiful place. Yeah. So you did undergrad in Vancouver as well, right? And that was when you were you studying finance as an undergrad?
No, I was in art. I was doing a Bachelor of Arts. And it's really what you do when you don't know what you want to do. I think I was a poli-sci major. because I knew I needed to be in college. I didn't know what to do when I was in college. I still think it probably took me 10 to 15 years after school to figure out what I wanted to do. So I did that, but I took some business courses and they just kind of clicked for me. And so that's kind of how I ended up. And I started working at a bank right after school. So that's kind of where I got my business education, was at a bank. And
Got it.
That's kind of how I got through undergrad. But yeah, it was through undergrad. I worked with the book stuff. I did it in my sophomore and junior year. I joke, the first year as a freshman seller, I think I finished 7th on the list. I had a good year. And then I went back, and I thought, as my father said, I thought I was an omnipotent, and I had figured it out. And instead of knocking on 80 doors, I figured I just have to find those 4, right? I'll just knock on the 4, right? So I tried to break the system, and I failed miserably. So I think I learned as much through that failure as through my success in that book world. So yeah, I had a really good year and a real bad year. Both taught me many lessons.
Yeah. Well, what's amazing is that you don't see many people who choose a career in finance and as a controller and all the things numbers related when they found success, sales, and human interaction. Usually, in people's minds, at least,
Right.
the role of sales and front-facing human interaction and accounting are two very different parts of it.
I think it goes to how I ended up here, right? I think I would argue over half my job is sales right now, right? And really, we can go kind of my career path, but when I got to Halliburton, I was in their strategy group, and then I went into IR, and IR is just sales. Investor relations is selling shareholders and investors on your story and convincing them why yours is a stock to buy. And it's literally just selling stock, or don't sell my stock. Buy my stock or don't sell my stock. And I think I had a natural aptitude for it, and that's where it applied. But usually the IR role is like the last role before CFO. It's kind of like you do everything else, and then you go into IR, you showed aptitude for it, and then, that could be a great gateway into CFO. I did the other way around. I did the IR first and found I was really good at it. And, the CEO at the time sort of sat me down and says, well, here's the skill sets you need to go get in order to be the story versus tell the story. And so he kind of gave me a checklist of treasury, tax, controller, you think all the roles a CFO plays.
Yeah.
And whether by design or by accident, I kind of subconsciously went and chased those jobs that tick the box, right? And so, and that's kind of what I did. And I wasn't really as concerned about whether I was at the same company or if it's another company, which is why you saw me do a bunch of different stuff. Funny, when you look at the different stuff I did, it was with the same people, right? So I was following people in most of those moves. And it was kind of, my decision process was, okay, yeah, it's a new company. Yeah, it's a new opportunity. Does it tick one of these boxes I'm trying to tick? And if it did, I did it. And that's kind of how it evolved. And then, I leapt to, when the CFO role I was able to get, I took it. And I learned a lot through the journey, because I went from a big, Fortune 50 company to a startup. And the CFO roles of those two different companies are very different. One, the pay is very different, but also the work experience is very different. So, and that was probably one of the bigger things I learned going through the different changes.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to zoom in on a few of those. So investor relations work that you did, was that at Halliburton when you're the strategic marketing manager there?
Well, so that was before. So when I got hired in Halliburton out of grad school, it was a rotational program where you spend 6 months. A lot of the companies do this with grad students. First stop was in the strategy group. The second stop was in IR. And then Halliburton declared bankruptcy because of asbestos lawsuit. And they had this big project in Brazil that was going sideways. And so that program kind of went away and says, well, this is what you are. Your rotation stopped. And so I got immersed in investor relations, which was fantastic because I spent in Halliburton, which is, 100, 150,000 people, relatively well-known company. They had one floor in Houston where you had the CEO, the CFO, the treasurer, general counsel, and me. And so it was like working at a small company because there's like 10, 15 people on this floor. And, you would have, they get the Chick-fil-A or the Burger King, and you have lunch in the boardroom with the CEO, and that was just normal, right? Which, as a 27-year-old recent grad is not normal.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It's not normal. And so, I was able to go to board meetings. I was able to travel on the plane with the executives. I was helping them prepare presentations. I got to work throughout the organization, kind of figuring out how to tell the story. And I kind of had an knack for it. But eventually, this is a true story. I said to the CEO, I said, hey, at some point I want to figure out how to run these things, not just talk about it. And he walked into my office one day and he goes, it was February, and he goes, Moscow or Angola? And I went, Moscow? And he said, okay, great. And 2 weeks later, I was living in Moscow. And that's when I became the strategic marketing manager of Eurasia for Halliburton. And really that job was, they wanted to bring someone with a formal education or a business education to work with business unit leaders, because there's like 6 business units in the country, on how to improve, fix, merge, acquisition, change. And so again, that was just an example. And part of that, when I was in IR, is when the CFO sort of gave me, Chris Scott was our CFO, who's probably still one of my favorite people, the list of things you need to go do and work on, and getting into the field was one of them. And so I actually got M&A work, and that was the starting of ticking all the boxes.
Yeah. So coming back to that, so one of the things that we always talk about is who have been kind of the mentors, or even if they weren't like a formal mentor, people that you maybe admired and wanted to emulate one of their qualities kind of throughout your journey. So what was it about either the CEO or the CFO that you had a lot of respect for there? What were some of the golden nuggets that you pulled from that time that kind of helped you in your journey?
Yeah. One, to get to that role in that kind of company it's almost like a Hunger Games, to survive, because there's a lot of people want those roles, and usually most people have pretty unique. Dave Lazar was the CEO and Chris Scott was the CFO. They were just generous with their time and just their decision making and the way they made decisions. Changed, it was just an amazing thing to see at such a young age. And so I think the way they made decisions, the way they processed information, when you get to companies that big, the amount of decisions they make, one of the things I learned is, you're going to get half your decisions wrong, and that's okay. But if you only make 2 decisions in a day, you only got 1 right. But if you make 100 decisions in a day, you got 50 right. So just keep moving and make decisions and move. And don't immerse yourself or bog yourself down in the perfect decision, because you'll never have perfect information. And
so, yeah, that's such an interesting thing, because, there's a lot of different like behavior assessments and personality tests, but one of the ones we subscribe to in our company is called Navigate. And, we qualify that there's a personality called the detective, right? There's 4 different types. And the detective is kind of like your engineer mind. And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times you see that role inside of accounting and finance, and sometimes in that CFO role, right? And one of their core strengths is how detail oriented they can be,
Right.
But one of the associated weaknesses is paralysis by analysis.
Yeah.
And so you see this like backlog of sometimes decisions because they're so afraid of making mistakes.
Right.
So it's so interesting to hear you say that, it's breadth of how many decisions you can make and not getting so tied up in every single one having to be 100% accurate.
And there's definitely a balance. You don't want to be careless with it, right? You don't want to be, kind of frivolous in the way you deal with it, or careless. But that first big mistake you make and then you survive it is a big step. But it's how you survive it and how you react to it is also equally important, right? Because you need to, you can't, not to be crass, but you can't be an idiot. You keep making a lot of bad, wrong decisions.
Right.
There's not enough right decisions out there to save you, right? So you still have to have some sort of level of confidence.
Yeah.
But just not be scared to, I don't want to say fail, but not be scared to make a mistake. But be prepared to react quickly to a mistake and accept a mistake early enough to fix it, right? Because it's some people double down and they keep digging. We used to joke, say, hey, put down the shovel. Put it down. Just put it down. You're done. You're done. You're already buried. You're dead. we're putting dirt on top of you now. Just put it down. And I think that makes a big difference.
Man, that's huge. So yeah, in my head, I would think like, they're getting it right 98% of the time at a level and only like 2% wrong. But I mean, they're, to me, 50% wrong decisions. That's a lot. But I think what I heard you say is that it's not just about it's kind of a principle that maybe it's not always about making the right decision, but it's about making a decision and then making it right on the back end, right? Like being able to take that mistake and turn it into something that's not as awful as the initial decision.
Right. Exactly. And when you have an awful, and let's be honest, you can't make a lot of awful decisions, but you're right. You can go down a path and go, hey, no, that's the wrong way. And then recalibrate, recorrect and fix. And don't have that pride before the fall kind of mindset of, well, I made that decision. That's what it's going to have to be. And I think that's probably as important, especially when you're dealing with so many big moving parts. You can't possibly know enough to know everything. Now you get better at these decisions as you get more experience. And I think I make fewer mistakes, or I correct it. It's almost like micro correcting. It's minor adjustments versus, well, I completely turned right. I should have turned left.
Micro correcting. I like that. Yeah. So make a mistake, but then because you can make little corrections, you learn from it. And that mistake ends up not being that big of a mistake because you adjust quickly. Yeah. Cool. So you went from like a really kind of an energy outfit. And I mean, there's a lot more to Halliburton than energy and the related fields that are in it, but to Burger King. I mean, to me, it couldn't be. Did you follow people to Burger King, or was that just
Yeah, that was a follow. So, I joked I went from destroying the earth to destroying waistlines, but it was following my CFO. The head of IR became the CFO of Burger King. He had the best email address. His last name was Burger, so it was cburger@whopper.com. And he was ticking a box. He's like, hey, I need smart people. I got a lot of things I got to fix. I got a lot of things I got to do. Would you mind joining me on this journey? And so, and I think I learned in the finance side, a lot of the times it's just widgets. We use widgets in economics all the time. You find similarities between business types and business models, and you focus on that. But in the end, finance is finance. Numbers are numbers, and management by numbers, and telling a story is telling a story. It's different if, like in aviation where I am now, it's one thing to go in and be a pilot versus being an engineer, right? That's completely different job scopes. But if I'm counting or keeping score of an engineer or keeping score of how a pilot does, it's kind of the same thing, right? So that's one of the beauties of finance is there is a certain amount of transferability of the skill set across industries. You just have to be able to learn real fast.
What did you, and I could dig into that too. I think it's so interesting because that, we say the same thing about sales. Like you go into a funeral services industry, and then you go to, a new software tech industry. And while they're vastly different, one's kind of old school, the other's totally new, the psychology, the principles, and the structure, need to be reflected if they're going to be
successful. The art of the sale, the evolution of a sale is the same.
Yeah.
Right. The emotional close, there's always be closing, there's the trial close, all that stuff is, I still remember. It still applies. It still applies.
Miss Jones, do you have a place where we can sit down?
Yeah, exactly.
Break eye contact. But so, if you talk about Burger King just for a second, you got to do a kind of an interesting thing there, right? Because you were there when and a part of the IPO for Burger King. So what did that mean, and what did you learn from that part of your experience?
So Burger King was an interesting company because McDonald's and Burger King in the 60s were kind of parallel. They were kind of the same size. McDonald's went public and became a real estate company. Burger King got bought by Pillsbury and became a subsidiary of a much bigger conglomerate. And at that point, McDonald's growth exploded and Burger King kind of became its number two poor cousin. But as a byproduct, because it was a subsidiary, it was either the CEO was always the person on the way up, or the person on the way out of the company, right? So every 2 to 3 years, you had a new vision, a new idea, a new concept, and it kind of lost its way. before I got there, Bain, TPG, and Goldman had bought it from Diageo, which was a liquor company. And so if you want to have a hard job in finance, have your board be comprised of Bain, TPG, and Goldman executives.
Wow.
Because those are some smart guys. And so I think the experience there was getting it IPO ready. The analogy I used, it was like the 40-year-old who lived in their parents' basement their whole life and finally rented their first apartment. That's what Burger King was as a company, because they'd always been dependent on the parent company for all their systems, all their internal, all their projects, all their procedures outside of making burgers. It was all kind of that whole kind of infrastructure that allows a company to thrive didn't exist. So I was brought in as part of a team to kind of put something in place and take it public. And we did it. And it was a fascinating experience. It was my job there, really. And it's a funny story. When I got interviewed for the job, I was originally going to be their director. I was going to be their head of European finance, head of finance for Europe. And I was on a plane from Australia. I was on the way to the airport in Australia to fly to London to go do that interview. And I got a call in the car and they said, well, the CEO just laid off everyone in London, so there's no job there. And I'm like, okay. Well, he goes, can you come to Miami? And I looked quickly and they said, we've booked you on a flight, keep going to the airport. So instead of going to the left, I went to the right. And so I flew to Miami, met with them, and they said, well, we just need smart people to kind of come in, and I have a list. He goes, I have a list of like 40 things that I need to fix. I don't know where to start, or I know where to start, but I need this done. And I said, yeah, that's, it's pre-IPO. And in my head, I was checking all these things in my head, right? That checklist I have. And then he said, well, what do you want me to call you? And I said, well, I need a good title to explain why I left Halliburton. So he said, how about Director of Global Finance? Perfect. That's what you're going to be. I don't know what my job meant, be Director of Global Finance, but that was my title. And I said, my pay was great. And so I was moving to Miami. And that's kind of how, so basically the sales pitch is, it's dead of winter in Russia. I can move to South Beach, make the same amount of money, get a great title, and be on a pre-IPO for one of the most preeminent brands. So I did it. And that's kind of how I switched.
Wow. Just to zone on one thing there, you'd said, it was pretty intimidating in some ways to have your board be comprised of Goldman and Bain and these companies that were helping with they were helping with the acquisition, they were acquiring the business, right?
They were the owners. So
they were the owners.
They were the owners. So we were trying to monetize it for them.
Got it. And so how did you, at this point you've had some great experience, but you're still pretty young, right? We're talking like
29.
Yeah. Okay. So like, how are you, when you're sitting in front of these guys, how do you prep for that? How do you not let intimidation and, affect your ability to kind of perform and educate and still have confidence in what you think is right?
I think I had the benefit of working with the C-level guys at Halliburton before, and I just realized they're just people. They're just guys. They're just men and women who are in a certain job. They're not different than anyone else you really hang out with. I think there's a bit of idolization that goes on in some of this culture, but in the end, they're just people, and they make mistakes too. And I think have confidence in yourself that, and maybe it was just my youthful ignorance of, I just was like, yeah, of course I'm supposed to be here. Why wouldn't I be here? And doing this kind of stuff. I never looked at it going, oh my God, I can't believe I'm here. I can't believe I'm doing that. It was like, yeah, I can do this. And, I think that's, whether that's hubris or naivete or what, you just kind of go do it. And then you find you have a good idea, and then one good idea goes to another idea, and it works out.
Yeah. So just a strong sense of self-worth too. And knowing that these guys, you're right.
These are good people who are encouraging, and they didn't, there's, some people unfortunately run into, I would call bad bosses, who make you feel insecure and kind of create that sense of doubt. And they were very different. They were fantastic.
Yeah. That's awesome. So, fast forward a little bit, you go from there to managing director of Quiznos.
Mhm.
there's so much to talk about in these transitions. Then you're back in kind of the sector you were with Halliburton with KBR,
Right.
which was the division. And then you make it all the way to where you're the CFO of Zytex. So maybe if you don't mind,
Yep.
if we jump into Zytex, like that was,
Sure.
how did that come about? And tell me about that experience.
So, I went back to, so Cedric left Burger King and he went back to KBR. And so that's how I ended up back at KBR. And it was a controller job, which was the one box I had not ticked. And that was a great experience because when I got there, we were 180 million, 100 million company, our revenue, like our group was 180 million and pretty small. I had an accounting team of 2. We did 3 acquisitions in that first year. And at the end of it, we were at 3 billion. My accounting group was 220. Our staffing just in our division was 20,000 people. And so that job went parabolic for me. And I found that's kind of the chaos and pace I crave kind of stuff. IR's like that. That was like that. And I promised the CEO or the president who I was reporting to, I wouldn't change jobs for 3 years because he had looked at me jumping and he's like, how do I know you're not going to leave? And I said, I'll give you 3 years. But at the end of 3 years, I'm going to want to do something different. And so I did it for 3 years. And almost at 3 years, I said, it's been 3 years, Dave. What's next? Like, I don't need to do something today. I just need to know what's next. And the CEO of the company at the time said, we love what you're doing. I want you to do that for another 10 years. Well, you don't tell me that.
Yeah.
If you knew me at all, you wouldn't tell me that. And so I just looked, and there was a recruiter who I'd had a relationship with, and he was recruiting for a job. It was a startup. It was owned by Shell Technology Ventures. It was one of their new venture startups, and they needed a CFO. And, it was kind of a title jump. Like when I think about when I got in there, it was a finance department of 1, right? At startup. And that was the biggest shock to that was when I was at Halliburton and I had a problem with treasury, I'd call treasury. When I had a problem with tax, I called tax. When I had a problem with, SEC regulations, I called our SEC guy. Everyone called me. Like I called those people in the startup, the number of my phone rang, right? So it's just me. And so I knew I wanted the title and I wanted to kind of figure out how to do it from a lower level. And that's what I got.
Yeah. So was that the first time that you didn't move by following leadership somewhere?
Well, ironically, the chairman of that company was a former Halliburton person, so he knew of me. So, but it was truly through a recruiter. It wasn't a pull. That was the first move I did after school. That wasn't a pull.
Yeah. Love that. So that was kind of your first, non-pull. Hey, I'm going at this thing, kind of almost solo CFO. I'm going to wear all the hats for a time.
Yeah.
And then Zytex got acquired by Schlumberger, right? Yep. So let me just pause for a second. I mean, we talk about being a student of the game, and I'm just kind of curious to keep up with all these different roles and positions and experiences. I mean, and you can be honest. I mean, were you an avid reader or like podcast person, or like were you doing intake and after hours, or was that like work all consuming?
Believe it or not, this is pre-podcast still.
Okay.
At this stage.
Radio.
Pre. I would always say I'm an avid reader. It used to be books. I used to read a lot of books. It's evolved to online, right? Like I probably read 60 or 70 articles kind of a day. I just kind of, and maybe not the whole thing, but I find the good ones I like. And that's more of a habit I've gotten into. But yeah, I've always been, it was business books before, and then and then one of the problems I found with business books is a lot of them I was reading were geared towards the big company. And, it'd be great, Good to Great or, the Jack Welch book to do a lot of these things. But when it's just me, a department of me, there's not a lot of leadership to really impart in those environments. So I think I try to stay current on current events and sort of see how the world's looking around me and try and be really aware, if whether I'm right or wrong, at least be ingesting all sorts of stuff. And that's kind of how I've evolved.
Yeah. And not to put you on the spot on this, but like, were there a couple highly influential, either like articles or books that you found throughout your tenure?
There's a couple of HBR articles that are in there. We did it in grad school, and I've read it a couple times since. Marketing Myopia, I think they make everyone read. And then there's a Christensen article about skate to something to great. It kind of talks about, the technology adoption curve, the chasm, between the early adopters and stuff. I found in startups was really helpful. Good to Great was a book you kind of had to read, which I thought applied to a lot of the stuff I did. I actually kept a binder. I should have looked at it before this call, of articles from grad school that I just printed and kept. And there's one, McGregor, that really sticks out. I think it's called McGregor. And it really became the formation of, I think there's the 60-Minute Manager. I think it became a book like that.
Yeah.
Where it really talked about the guy who was like the top, and he had time for golf, he had time for relaxing and doing all this stuff. He wasn't busy all the time, right? And really the idea was how does he have so much time with such a big job? And there's a really fun, there's two instances, one at Halliburton, one at KBR, that reinforced it after the fact. I remember I just started in IR, and it was the original CFO, and he had, I put together a deck, and I was all proud. I had done a presentation, and I kind of went in. It was one of my first ones I'd done. And I said, hey, I've got 3 ideas for this slide. And I put the 3 out there, and I go, which one do you want to use? And he looked at me and he goes, if I have to pick, I don't need you. I was like, I pay you to tell me what you want to present. No, I'll tell you if you're wrong, but I pay you to make that decision. So that was the first one. The second time I remember, I had a boss, his name was TV, Abercrombie, and he was a classic Texan. He had like the Longhorn, he had the Longhorn thing above his desk. He's a relatively large man. He was incredibly, he'd been doing this forever. And he was one of those people you just sit in and he kind of teach you. And I remember he asked, he wanted to do something, and I was kind of like humming and hawing. And he's like, Ryan, there's an accountant in Texas who's going to do this. I'd love for it to be you. And he just, I was like, huh, all right, I guess I better go do that. And it's kind of going to, when you're working for somebody, if you're working for a director, if you're a manager or an analyst, what your boss is looking for is to come with the answer. Like, here's the problem, here's how I do it. Don't wait for the boss to solve it, because the boss doesn't want to solve it. The boss wants to see your solution and see, does that work? And get really good at solving. I think this is something at Southwest we talked about, is he who solves the most problems makes the most money. And really problem solving and figuring, because there's a way to do a lot of things, and there's no one way, but being that person proactively solving things is, and I look for that in the people I work with or work with me, is, come to me with, hey, I'm going to do it this way. And I'll be like, all right, that works, and because when you get to, and this is what I saw, when you get to that level, you can't solve every problem. You can be an arbitrator, you can be a decision maker, you can go yes, no, but you can't evaluate you don't have the time to properly do it. And so that's kind of, it's a roundabout way. The McGregor book, the McGregor article really talked about that. And one of the things in it, he would, this person, he ran a plant, and I think it was in Montreal, and every week he'd designate a person who was the decision maker for the week. So if you had a day-to-day low-level decision, you would call Ken or you'd call Sue for that week, and Sue would have to make the decision. Now, you would review at the end of the week, how'd you do? And it was also decisions that weren't going to destroy the plant, but it got people in the practice of making decisions and owning decisions and going into what I talk about, the course correcting and realizing, I made the wrong decision. How do I fix the decision? Versus, kind of hiding in the cave or trying to cover a bad decision and make it better the other way.
Yeah. And that's great, because you do have to, if you end up being the type of CFO or leader that feels the need to control it all, because you don't want the mistakes to happen, it's going to be a small,
you're going to either be in a really small company or you're going to be miserable.
Right. Yeah. Because you never get to delegate or empower and offload, and there's just too many.
You don't become a force multiplier. You become limited by the number of hours you can work in a day.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then last part of like where we contemporary, here we are today. Now you're in the airline space
Yeah,
as a CFO. And I'm not 100% sure this is what it is, but the Talon acquisition, is that a SPAC?
Yep.
Okay. So, and then also a SPAC happening simultaneous to you doing this. So, that's it. Have you guys found your baby yet?
Working on it.
Okay, cool. So for all you listeners out there, if you have,
no zero disclosures on this podcast.
Yeah, no disclosure. But in the airline space, what does the size of your team look like now at what is it, Global Crossing? Yeah.
Yeah. So Global Crossing has been probably one of the more fun experiences I've had. I got into aviation, and this is actually a funny story too. So I was working in oil and gas with a private equity group. They had acquired they had invested in an airline in Canada. They needed a Canadian and a CFO, and they had liked the work I was doing on the energy side for their energy group. And they said, "What do you know about aviation?" I go, "Well, I like to fly," right? And they're like, "Well, perfect. You're the new CFO. Can you go up there and figure out what's going on?" And that became, I did 2 years working with this airline up there that was moving from a charter operation to a scheduled service. And I found at first I found a ton of similarities, and I talked about this before, looking through the similar prism to the way Halliburton worked with their frac fleet, right? So if you think about an airline, it's a 24-hour business. It uses expensive equipment. It breaks a lot. If you screw up, people die, right? And if you think about energy services in fracking, for example, that's kind of a similar kind of situation, right? And it comes down to how well do you utilize the equipment you have, and that really drives your profitability. So through that lens, I looked at it, and then I was able to probably understand it faster. And again, I found that kind of sage, veteran who'd been doing it for 50 years. His name was Bill, and I would just go in his office and just ask questions, a ton of questions. And, generally a question would come with a great 20-minute story, and then you get an answer. But it was a really, really cool way. I got my doctorate in aviation from this gentleman. And then an opportunity arose in Miami with an investor group who was starting an airline. And this was pre-COVID. And, my family's in Miami, and I was commuting to Canada with the other job, and it made a lot of sense to stay. So it was, I was employee number 3 at this airline, and was just myself, the founder, and our kind of head of ops. And we did a reverse merger with a Canadian airline, and off we went. And so fast forward, and then COVID hit. And so we were launching an airline during COVID, which was unique in its own right.
Oh yeah.
We eventually we got it certified as an airline. We launched in August of last year. We're at 6 aircraft right now. We're over 300 people. We're projecting to be at 12 aircraft by the end of the year with cargo operations, and we're probably close to 900 people. So it's been, and in the meantime, we also spun out a Canadian airline from that group, which I was the chairman of for a period of time, and it's going to get certified this month. And it'll start launching operations called Canada Jet Lines, and we did the SPAC at the same time. So, like a true immigrant, I have 3 jobs. So
nice. What's the most, at this stage of your career, what do you think would you say is one of the most challenging things for you?
I think one of the things that's always been challenging is the breadth of choice. I think if you get educated and you get great experiences, you get a lot of options. And how do you pick what you want to do, right? And how do you find what you like? And how do you say no to stuff, right? And so I think there's a lot of, and even in aviation, and even with our company, that's kind of the scope creep or company creep. It's really easy to get pulled into some really fun stuff. We only have so much time in the day, and I think probably the biggest challenge is being judicious with spending the time on the stuff I want to spend time with. My family's really important to me. My kids are really important, and I refuse. I don't. My kids are 7 and 9. You'll probably see them walk around in the background and blur because it's a sick day. But I think I don't want to be one of those dads. They turn 20 and be like, "Holy crap, I missed it."
Right.
So I really try and find whether it's a balance with all that stuff, to find a way to kind of say, no, I'm going to do X. If that means I'm working when they go to sleep or, or whatever, it's kind of finding its priorities. I was to say the hardest thing is priorities, is making sure you make them and stick to them.
Making, on the business side, it would be focusing on things that really drive the most success for your department, for the company, and then not getting distracted with all the squirrels and the acorns, right? And then, and then having, like you said, prioritization and boundaries for family and for work, even when you've got a lot on your plate. Yeah, I love that. I kind of want to, I know we're running a little light on time, but I have to ask this question. I won't end on it. We'll talk about one last thing before it, but it's just so interesting to always hear this, because, there are CFOs that'll listen to this podcast, and I'm kind of curious, what's like, if you look back on your whole career, what's like the biggest mistake you feel like? We talked about 50% mistakes, 50% successes, but what do you think was like the mistake that you were like, oh man, this is it?
There's a lot of those. I think, one of the things I think about being a CFO is you have to be schizophrenic to do it well, right? Because half your job is to tell the past, right? Is to record the past and make sure it's accurate and effective. The other half is to be able to predict the future and plan for the future. And those are completely two different divergent mindsets. And so, biggest mistakes. Here's what you'll learn about me. I'm almost like Memento with this, right? Like when I've made them, I process them and forget them. Wasn't Ted Lasso be a goldfish?
Or reframe it as like, even at like maybe the most challenging moment in your one of the most challenging moments in your career, where there was, a split in roads, or it's just a really tough decision to make, or.
Yeah, I think it was probably more career path choices, right? Like, I think when Schlumberger bought Zytex, Schlumberger had a CFO, so that job was taken. So obviously I needed to figure out what I was going to do next, and I had, it was proverbial fork in the road. I had like 3 different things, and I tried to do all 3, and that didn't work. And then I did one. I took a punt on one, and it was a long shot, but I knew it was a long shot. Like I went into it going, it's a long shot, and that didn't work. So it was kind of a series of there's that. And I think now that I'm talking through it, I think the biggest challenge is when, as a CFO, you're a messenger in a lot of cases, right? And the biggest challenge is when the person you tell the message to doesn't like the message, and they ask you to change it.
Ooh, yeah.
And I had a very distinct, now it's coming back to me. I had a very distinct a moment, and it kind of triggered a career change where, and it's actually it happened twice, where they wanted to. One was an example of they wanted a budget to say X, and I said, well, I think it's going to be Y. But they said, if we say X, then we don't get bonus. And I'm like, well, it's not going to be X, it's going to be Y. And that boss basically redid the budget, presented to the board, and then asked me to go. Hindsight, it ended up being X, and the owner called me back and asked me to join him. So I did get validation on that. And I think in another situation, it was a similar token where the owner wanted to, or the CEO wanted to go one direction. And I think this happens to all CFOs. It's happened. The more senior you get, the more proactive a CEO you get, the more often it's probably going to happen. But you will see it differently. And how do you manage different? And how do you manage when your different is bad news?
Yeah.
Because it's not always, everyone's happy when you're making money. What happens when you miss? What happens when you think you're going to miss? What happens when you think the decisions being made are going to guarantee you miss, and you articulate it and they don't like that? And how do you navigate that? And the good bosses will understand, and you work together to kind of figure out how to make it work. Sometimes you're wrong. Like sometimes I was wrong, and it was like, no, it's actually going to end up better. I didn't know everything. So it's knowing you don't know everything, but it's also being confident to have an open discussion with your CEO. And if you can't have an open discussion with your CEO about what you see, you're not doing your job.
Yeah, and open and honest. Yeah, I love that. Leave us with this last thing, and I know we're on time. What would you tell all this experience that you've had? What would you tell your 21? I mean, listen, it's turning out phenomenal for you. But what advice would you provide for your 21-year-old self?
When it's, there's going to be days where it doesn't look like it's going to work. Trust yourself, right? And just kind of, and that's kind of have this inner belief in yourself that it's going to work out. And while the path might not be clear, there isn't one path, and there isn't one way to do it, and you can make any path work, right? So even the decisions I made where I went one way or could have gone another, I probably could have, that could have worked out too. It would have worked out different. And just when you make a decision, make it, and don't linger on it, because there's nothing. Once you've turned, then you can turn left. You can't go back and make that same turn. Yeah. So I think is be open to new stuff. Don't get paralyzed in oh my God, look at all these different roads. Always be moving forward and have faith in your ability just to figure something out.
That's awesome. Yeah, love that. Great advice. Well, we packed in a lot. I mean, you have such an interesting career, and I know we didn't get to dial into every single part of it, but I think there are a lot of really good nuggets in this interview, and I appreciate you being willing to make the time and share. So
awesome. Appreciate it, Adam.
Yeah, if you ever take a private charter jet on Canadian jet lines.
No, it'll be on Global Crossing. You'll actually see it. If you're on a sports team, we flew the Final Four team. You'll see our planes everywhere. It says Global Crossing. It's got a big X. You're going to see probably about 50 of them, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years.
That's amazing. Yeah, I love it. Cool, man. Well, feel free to come and pick me up here in Houston anytime you'd like. And
Absolutely.
I'll make that journey. All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks,
See you,
Adam.
brother. Take care.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.